I come from a fairly long agricultural background. But the last couple of generations, my dad decided time to move on. So he moved to a little town called Blacksburg, Virginia, and he was the first one to leave the farm. I was the first one that was born off of the farm. Okay, in my lifetime, I had the chance to spend summers back on the farm, so I worked on the farm. You know, it was a weird exposure to agriculture because, you know, I missed planting and I missed harvesting and I did everything in between. But, you know, but there was still a pretty strong connection to our food in my generation. Now let's fast forward to my children. They were not born in Minnesota, but moved here when they were pretty young. And it dawned on me that we really had ended up raising city kids. We didn't have a chance with them to get them, you know, to the farm. And so, you know, this disconnect, you know, that we're seeing, you know, between particularly our younger generation and agriculture and the land, you know, I think in general, is something that has concerned, you know, a lot of us, you know, for, you know, a fairly long period of time here. I also teach a freshman seminar. Now, in that seminar, we have 20 students, and they're broadly from across the university. Every year I ask, how many of y'all grew up on farms? And how many have been on a farm? This year when I asked that question, how many grew up on farms, one hand went up. I asked how many have been on a farm, one more hand went up. 18 out of 20, you know, students, and these are freshmen coming into the University of Minnesota, had never been on a farm. Okay, that's eye-opening, particularly for those of us that are teaching in colleges of agriculture. Let's think about how we have these conversations in ways that do bring our younger generations, you know, back into agriculture. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I moved into this position of Associate Dean. So this part's about communication. A lot of people want to come talk to me. Some of them are in this room. Usually they want money. That's okay. You know, we talk about it, some other resources. But a lot of times they got some sort of problem, and a lot of times that problem involves communication. It's absolutely unbelievable how many times you got two people, and when you sit down and talk for a while, you begin to see they're really talking about the same thing. They're just not connecting. You know, it's just not, they're not on the same page that way. Again, you know, that's something that's very critical, I think, in this arena because so many of us are coming from very different backgrounds. Let me give an example. I mean, I'm a soil scientist. So, we got our own language in soil science. You know, so I can talk about a Mollicapleyudolph that has a high cation exchange capacity and a low linear coefficient of extensibility. Anybody have any idea what I just said? I basically just said, well, it's a prairie soil that grows plants pretty well. You know, so we all have our own disciplinary languages like that. And one of the challenges, you know, and it's actually easier, I think, for us to talk in those disciplinary languages than it is, you know, to the broader community. And we've come together in this type of forum, and I think it's really important, you know, that we try to find what that common language is. Now, yesterday afternoon, I was kind of sitting, listening to the conversations, and I'll admit, you know, all of us tend to get in our little silos a little bit, and I've really appreciated having the chance to come here and talk, you know, to people from a lot of different backgrounds, particularly, you know, in the social sciences. And but there was some terminology that I had a little trouble with, and I wanted to throw some of these out. Now, you know, these are probably my shortcomings more than anything, but these were in yesterday's talk. Feminine developmental theorist. I don't know what that is, but maybe somebody can explain it to me. There was one I really liked, zombie theory. I'm going to use that one. And then I learned not only do we have zombie theories, but we also have zombie discourses. Okay, so great terms. I love that. Cultural determinism. As a soil scientist, I'm not sure. Those of you from the social science background, those were some things that confused me as I was listening, you know, to the conversations, and also delighted, you know, to some extent. And I think the main question, that we had for a panelist is how do people of different methodological and political vantage points craft productive conversations? And if I put that in my language as, well, how do we talk together? I think that's kind of the basic point. So I hope that's a question that we gave you guys, right? Is that close?
I got that.
Okay. Well, let me briefly introduce our two panelists. Next to me here is Jeffrey Pilcher. He's history at the University of Minnesota, teaches classes on food and drink and world history. He's also editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook on the History of Food. Okay. Daniel Block, sitting at end of the table. His background is in geography from Chicago State University. He's also coordinator of the Frederick Bloom Neighborhood Assistance Center, which provides technical and research assistance to neighborhood-based community and economic development organizations. He has an extensive background in food studies, geographic information systems, and founding member of the Chicago Food Systems Collaborative. So I've asked each of them to, have about 15 minutes or so for some comments. Jeffrey, I'll just turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I hope I answer your question, although I think I'm going to do it in a little bit of a different fashion than perhaps it was posed. I sort of was wondering why I was chosen actually to be on this panel, and I assumed that it was because I'm a world historian of food, and so presumably I would have something to say about feeding the world. And then, of course, I get here and I discovered that, in fact, this conversation is about feeding many things. We're feeding the community, we're feeding Iowa, we're feeding the future, we're feeding the university. Now, we've heard a lot about that one, but it turns out that feeding the world is actually a paradigm, it's a trademark, it's a humanitarian plea, but it's not actually our job. Which actually is okay, because the world really does a perfectly adequate job of feeding itself. But more on that later. Okay, so let me just give a little bit of a background about myself, not necessarily where I come from, but where I come from disciplinarily. World history is kind of an oddball group, even among that peculiar group of historians. And so historians really sort of like to get their fingers, if not dirty, at least kind of dusty from the archives. And world historians are the type who actually sort of disdain that dust and sort of think big thoughts about, sort of surveying the world. And actually I teach a sort of a survey of world history, which actually I'll go you one better. So none of our students have been on a farm. This past semester in world history, I asked not a freshman seminar of 20 students, but one of these big surveys of 200. How many of the students had actually been in a factory? Okay, how close was industry to your lived experience? How many of you have a family member who is a factory worker? And there were a couple of hands out of 200. So, I'm not sure where we are in this world. I mean, certainly post-agricultural, but post-industrial. I didn't at that point ask, so what do you guys do? But what I'd like to do in this talk is to just sort of give a kind of big world historical perspective and just kind of touch on some of the themes and not necessarily draw anything together, but try to point out one of the things we've been talking about is who's not at the table. And certainly somebody I noticed who's not at the table, but perhaps should be, is really, we were talking about food studies, this group of ASFS, Ag and Human Values, and other groups that meet together every year, and to talk about feeding the world, basically. And the Michael Pollan of foodies who actually know something, sort of this rock star of food studies is Warren Belasco, who's kind of a gentle, unassuming old hippie, sort of an Ivy Tower J.I. Rodale, if you will. Wrote a book called Meals to Come. And basically what he did was looked at 200 years of discourses on food supplies. You know, how we've been talking about this question for 200 years. And he identifies three paradigms. The first of which he calls the cornucopians, and these are the soil scientists, the plant geneticists, and pathologists. This is, in Claire Hidrick's phrase, they're the Iowa State folks, right? Or the Minnesota folks, right? The people who are going to feed the world. And although Belasco traces this all the way back to the Enlightenment and the Marquis de Condorcet. So anyway, so that's that sort of optimistic view that we will always, you know, produce more food. Okay. Second, Belasco identifies the Malthusians, and of course, naturally, these are the economists. And although it's an imperfect comparison, it sort of sounds like Penn State is somewhere in this group. And of course, these are the ones who sort of, you know, say, oh, well, we're all going to starve, and in fact, if we try to do something to solve the problem, it'll only make it worse. And then the third group of, in this ongoing conversation, are what Belasco calls the Redistributionists. And these are the social scientists. It sounds like the Cornell group sort of falls in that category, although Belasco traces it back to William Godwin. You know, the idea is that we'd all be okay if we just divided up the food a little more fairly. Now, these conversations haven't exactly been repeating themselves because Warren is a historian, and, you know, we're interested in change over time, and so he identifies how these discourses have evolved. But I think the important point to keep in mind is that Warren observes how the conversation is self-perpetuating. In other words, so for example, the Malthusian fears keep the cornucopians in business, right? That you know, by having somebody to argue against, they are in essence continuing their own relevance. Thinking about how these conversations actually have a history. So the second thing I wanted to point out is and again, sort of recalling some things that have already been said, is that, you know, I mean, food sheds, food systems, agriculture is constantly restructuring itself, right? This is a historical process that has been going on for a very long time, you know, as Maggie observed. And here, actually, I want to also point to an observation that Rick made, and that is that this is not a unilinear process, right? We're not all going towards, you know, some view of technological advance and progress and some one model. In fact, these things tend to go in lots of different directions, right? And so one of the questions that has been going around here is like, can we go back, right? You know, so now we're down to 2% of our population here in the U.S. is in the countryside. You know, we can't go back. And yet, I'm thinking of examples where, in fact, industrial labor did go back to become peasants. Now, it's a kind of a special case, but I'm thinking here of post-abolition Caribbean slavery. Right? This is we talked about mentioned Sidney Mintz here, and you know, before Sidney Mintz started doing sugar, he was talking about the reconstitution of a peasantry. Right? And of course, you know, we don't think of sugar production, of plantation slavery as a form of industry, but in fact, Mintz shows us that it was. And that given a chance, these, well, slaves were more than happy to rediscover themselves as peasants. And, you know, we can think of other examples like that, you know, late antiquity and other ones. And I think that one thing to keep in mind is that our own vision of the countryside, right? And here for a very long time, it's been, you know, bumpkins. So it's not just for a couple hundred years that there have been bumpkins, right? I mean, basically, as long as there have been cities, the cities have been places where they think of the people out in the farms, not just as bumpkins, but as somebody to exploit. Right, you know, since Sargon in ancient Sumeria, or since the three legendary emperors of China, you know, it's you have that peasantry so that you can have a good time in the city. there was a discussion about how the commercialization of agriculture took place in our lifetime. Incidentally, I'm not saying here that I'm encouraging that slavery is a good thing or that going back to the peasantry would be a pleasant option. But just throw that out there. It's sort of the commercialization of agriculture in our lifetime. And indeed, there have been stunning changes that we've seen, and I mean, really remarkable. And yet, another historian, Nick Cullather, was recently on campus and pointed out that, in fact, the Green Revolution was drawing from agricultural research that had been going on for a very long time, and that it was actually a work of PR, if you will, setting up the plots just right to show why modern agriculture was so dramatically superior to traditional agriculture. And so there was a little bit of fiddling in the experiment there that we should keep in mind. I actually wanted to talk more about food riots and because this was something that came up at the very end of one of the panels yesterday, and Amartya Sen's very important work on basically how food riots are political and always have been. And here I just want to very briefly mention that, we sort of have this image of what a food riot looks like, sort of picturing these starving people in Haiti or something, desperate at the end of their rope, and acting madly from starvation. But in fact, if we look at food riots, we see they're actually really quite organized groups. In Latin America, they're often referred to as cacerolazos, which basically means the big bang of the cooking pot. And because what happens is that people sort of go out and parade and bang their cooking pots and say, look, we know this is a political problem here, right? That there is food around and we want access to that food. And the irony is that now it's to the point where we even get middle class cacerolazos. But of course, the middle class people bring their maids so that they can bang on the cooking pot, so they sort of maintain their class distinctions, even while having a food riot. But again, I mean that these are political creations, right? It's not actually about not having enough food, although obviously food shortages are part of it, but really the key question here is who actually gets the food? How is it distributed? And that is a political question. Well, we've talked about who's not here, and we've obviously pointed out that business is not here. Where's ADM? Where's Cargill? But one of the groups, one word that I don't think I've heard once here, and that we absolutely need to think is the word war. Okay? The land-grant university was a product of the Civil War. It didn't just happen in 1862. It happened because West Point was not large enough to produce an officer class in an age of national war. The Green Revolution, these productivity gains were in large part driven by the demand for supplies during World War II. Reshaping the farm really throughout the Americas, right? So you have food shortages in Latin America in response to the demand for industrial oil crops in the Allied war effort. I'll just point out one other thing. They started growing opium in the mountains of western Mexico to make morphine, and thinking of unintended consequences, right? The Green Revolution was fundamentally a product of the Cold War, and I'm not saying that's necessarily a recipe for successful development, but we've not really been thinking about sort of how war fits into that. Now, just very briefly, one of the questions has been: so can we imagine an alternative system where where we can produce things? And I'm a historian. I don't have I can't point out how the soil is going to do it, but I can tell us the last time we really did have a truly dramatic increase in productivity in farms around the world. And that was the Columbian Exchange, beginning in 1492, when all of these crops, which had been unknown, were suddenly taken to new areas and planted and brought these dramatic increases. And if we look at how that happened, and there's a wonderful book by a Mexican anthropologist, Arturo Warman, which is sort of a history of corn. He actually calls it, in the English translation is History of a Bastard. And it's a bastard genetically for reasons I won't go into, but it's also a bastard because it's always been, until really quite recently, the crop of the dispossessed. The people farming land that's so crappy that they can't grow anything else. And actually corn, although you wouldn't know it looking at an Iowa field, does a remarkable job climbing hills. I mean, if you go to Mexico, you will see corn growing on land that would, I mean, you know, mountain goats have trouble with. And so if we think about what are those overlooked crops that could fit into new systems, that, it seems to me, is where the potential for more feeding. But also, and just as one final point I'd like to say, is that perhaps we need to look outside of big universities for new ideas about how to feed the world. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Danny Block, and I wanted to, especially since you mentioned soils, I thought I'd kind of talk a little bit about my journey to this place, and focus within that on different kinds of speaking about food issues that sort of went along, and give you a little thoughts on how maybe we might more successfully speak to each other about food. Okay. So, going way back, my mom grew up in rural Ohio, not actually on a farm, but kind of next to farms. And we go back to Ohio, and my grandfather did grow up on a farm, and I talked to my grandfather about it, and he was, I don't know, kind of a rural kind of person. And how, for whatever reason, he and my grandmother were very, and the fact that they were rural people, we grew up in Chicago, so in a very urban environment, was really important to the way that myself and my sister actually kind of, I guess, chose what we wanted to study and what we. Getting to food for me was actually kind of a long sort of process. I was, as an undergrad here at Macalester, I was a geography major and also a geology major. And I really sort of expected myself to study earthquakes. But I took a class my senior year on soil conservation in Africa. And I just thought this seemed like a really good place to bring together sort of an interest that I had in sort of kind of human geography and the development of cities, which probably came out of me growing up in Chicago, with an interest, with my geologic interest. So I went off to the University of Illinois, and I was going to study soil conservation in Africa through a political ecology perspective, working in geography. But I was really trying to sort of split between physical science and social science parts of geography. So I went out to Nebraska and I studied the Conservation Reserve Program in the northern part of Nebraska, in the Sandhills area, and looked at soil erosion on fields, center pivot irrigated fields out there. Which I suppose I maybe should explain all that stuff. But it was basically working out I lived on a ranch, and I looked at farms and fields, and they were irrigated and they were blowing away because it was built on sand and they were plowing up sand hills to plant corn, and that was the story. But it was really fun to be out there. But I just could not explain this to my friends in Chicago because, like, you know, I had a friend who did her master's thesis on Viennese coffee shops, and I just couldn't get through. When I got back to Chicago and to Illinois, I decided I really wanted to look at this relationship between consumers and producers, and of course, then urban and rural. Of course, there are rural consumers and urban producers now too. But I had this kind of idea that I really wanted to look more at how basically farmers and the farm sector and the consumer sector and the folks and the regulators that were regulating the sort of created the rules that kind of contextualize the farm sector. I wanted to look at how that sort of relationship played out. And then I was over at the Harold Washington Library in downtown Chicago, and I came across a document from 1918 that talked about milk prices. And what was interesting is there was a City of Chicago commission, like a city council, I think it was actually a committee at the city council that wrote this, and it included not just sort of the commissioner of this and that from the city, but also representatives of some of the local dairy cooperatives, and I think, I'm starting to remember, I think a number of other farm groups. And the fact that there were sort of farmers on a city council commission in Chicago was just amazing to me. So I decided to look more into this. And I wound up studying milk for my dissertation. And because of the fact that by studying the development of milk rules and milk, and not just, I should say milk marketing and the rules that surround it, so the development of what's now called the Milk Marketing Order Program. It involved a lot of negotiations between urban and rural, and between cooperatives and the public health department. And so there was all of these sort of players involved at these different levels. And it revealed at least a lot back then about how this sort of urban-rural discourse was going, and it interestingly wound up kind of, basically they gave up in the New Deal and went to the USDA and said, all right, you guys regulate us, because we can't figure this all out. And how the USDA put that into place was a Milk Marketing Order Program. So at least that ag program had a lot to do with these sort of urban-rural discourses back then. Now, how over time, the urban voice sort of maybe, if not disappeared, but declined. But agricultural programs have a lot to do with, one of the reasons is they're based on providing relatively cheap and hopefully relatively safe food to a growing urban population. And there's still that kind of emphasis within many of the emphases that ag programs have. So that's one of the reasons we should talk to each other. And when I came to Chicago State, I had these sort of dual interests in food, and I also had been working as a cartographer. I was trying to figure out how to bring maps together with food. And I went to a meeting with a bunch of community activists and said, well, what we really need is a map of all the supermarkets in Chicago. And I kept going to these community meetings. And we didn't have any money to put this map together, so we kept going. And it took about 2 years, and finally we got some money from the Kellogg Foundation to do a sort of community university collaboration to do a number of things, including map supermarkets. And that was the Chicago Food Systems Collaborative. And what was really neat about it is perhaps that it did not get funded for anything for 2 years. because we sort of were able to meet and talk about what we were doing and build sort of connections over a long period of time, and be able to figure out how to talk to each other, and figure out these things like who is missing from the table at the time. And who was at the table was, a geographer, some urban studies folks, eventually somebody from nursing, somebody from public health nutrition, and a number of community organizations. The amount of learning that came out of the students and the community members working together, we did a focus group afterwards as part of the evaluation, and they were like, hugging each other, and it was really inspiring. Another set of discussions that happened was between myself especially and my main partner, who was a public health nutritionist. And we, together with the community groups, wrote a paper for the journal Public Health Nutrition, in which I had to totally change the way I write, because it was just like I would usually, in my articles, we'd have this whole theory section, or we'd have a whole expository kind of thing, and get much longer, lots more words, and this was you had to have like specific sections, like here was the methodology, and here was the results, and here was the next steps, and here was the limitations, and that was not my kind of thinking. But it wound up being very productive for both of us. And like a year later, I was talking to a friend of mine who is a medical researcher, and I was telling her this story, and she stopped me in the middle and said, "Yeah, I know. I tried to write with this social scientist, and boy, they wanted to go just on and on and on and on." And I was trying to complain about the medical scientists who just wanted to keep it. And it really. It made me think of, here we are, worked on the same project for a year, and we still were learning how to talk within our, to be able to talk within our same disciplines, but yet we really were united on the importance of this project. So there were still these talking issues. So it's sort of a constant sort of battle, figuring out how to speak to people, but then the project itself brings you together. Now, I want to tell just another collaboration story on the other end, because one of the nice things is that was a very sort of collaboration took a long time to sort of germinate, and was fairly equal. Now, I've been involved with other collaborations in which maybe I have some money and I want to find a community group to partner with, and I go in and say, well, this is our thing, this is what we would need you to do. And that doesn't tend to work as well. And I think, that I'm usually working with community groups, but I've actually been on the other end of that with a university collaboration. As I said, I'm an adjunct at Northwestern, but some health researchers at Northwestern wanted to do a study using women at Chicago State. Chicago State is a predominantly African-American institution. We have a lot of 70% women. The average age is 27. So they were doing a study of, I think, women over 30. And we have a good population, and we were trying to figure this out, and it was so top down. Like we started, like Northwestern didn't want to. They were going to do all of the interviews at Chicago State, but they didn't want to do a subcontract, so we wouldn't get into the overhead. And these kinds of issues you probably have internally about these sorts of things. But it's there has to be kind of a respect coming either from the university to, in this case, another university. But if one part of the university approaches another part with an idea, these sorts of sharing things, have to be negotiated out, but they also have to be a question of how, what does everybody get out of it? And there needs to be some reason to trust the other parties. and also some reason that we feel that this is going to be good for our part of the university or our community group or whatever. So that, getting that trust going both takes a lot of time and takes a lot of energy to focus on. What we have, some of our benefits, because we're working on food, is food itself is a great thing to collaborate on, because as Richard Wilk talked about yesterday, there's so many different perspectives that are needed to study any one food problem in a sort of full way, that I think it's kind of difficult for people to sort of deny that, say, soil scientists are important in studying corn, or or at least in studying fertility, and agronomists are important, and historians of corn, and sociologists who might study the food system and the connections between them. All, so we can see these things very easily. Another great thing, in a more general way, is that we have these stories. I think Richard Wilk said this yesterday too, but we all have stories about shopping, about eating. It's great when you're working with community organizations or giving community-based presentations or something, especially on what I do, food desert research now. I mean, everybody has some story, and you can kind of relate that story back. So in that sense, food almost by necessity is, or by almost sort of part of the reason that most of us are interested in it, I think probably all of us here, because we're at a food presentation, is because we both care about it in sort of a visceral way, and we know that this idea of feeding our cities or feeding the world or something is important. I mean, food is sort of obviously both something we enjoy, we have stories on, and also is obviously important to our society. So we don't really have to kind of push ourselves into figuring it out how it relates to what we each do. The issues surrounding food and the development of both the modern urban food system and the modern world food system are kind of, I would guess, obviously sort of part of the central core of what I would think would be the university's mission. I'm speaking from afar. But it would seem like the University of Minnesota is uniquely sort of positioned to bring together the focuses on urban food systems and urban food policy, and sort of the more traditional extension focuses of an agricultural land grant school in a way that would be really unique. So I hope to see that happen. Thank you.
So our first listener is Randel HANSON. Randel is with the Geography Department at the University of Minnesota Duluth, our sister institution to the north, and he's an expert on food systems planning and food shed analysis. And I'm going to ask him to come forward because we want to be sure we capture all this on...
I am charged with a nice seat, first of all, and with being a listener, and that's been a haunting role in a variety of ways, that mostly good. And there's a number of conversations for me that have resonated beyond and throughout all of the conversations, as well as for me last night and the night before, to think about how do we converse, how do we structure conversations, and then importantly, how do we structure things within the academy to do this. It's about connections, it's about networks, and there's a lot in that short phrase, not only intellectually, but of course institutionally. And I think that, for me, deserves a lot of reflection and rumination about what that means in terms of this larger coming together of this weekend and how that gets mobilized. Our ability to acknowledge the values of our inquiries, or our inability, our willingness and our unwillingness. Some of the code words that have surplus value beyond our intellectual relationship to them, moral and emotional, and how that both builds bridges as well as puts up barriers to how we can have these conversations. You know, our allegiances to our disciplinary borders. You know, of course, the structural obstacles that keep us in St. Paul or Minneapolis or wherever internally, CLA, etc. And I think obviously these are important observations that deserve rumination beyond this conference in terms of how we address these issues. The boundaries that are both within us and around us that structure how we can have this conversation. So that, yeah, our conversations are broad and over the course of these days, but they're also isolated, as Don pointed out. Cargill's not in the room, Monsanto's not in the room, and a host of other players whose power is enormous in food conversations and food acts. So how do we create structured and sustained academic conversations that can create space for teaching and research, lead to structural change, that institutionalize transformative ways of addressing food and egg issues off campus that respond to 21st century issues? How do we mobilize resources sufficient to do something meaningful? These are conversations that, that have repeatedly been brought up today and yesterday and the day before. You know, is it possible without substantially changing the politics around us? Is it meaningful to talk about instituting change around these issues when the major players of the food system as such aren't part of this university any longer? And so the scope of the project, it seems like, in this meeting, revolved around several terms: agriculture, food, food systems, and food skills. And these, of course, spill out into other spheres: ecology, social movements, social stratification, power relations, political economy, and so forth. And in all of these terms, we have deep institutional histories of labor that are important, but are checkered. I think of terms like, or spheres like production research, home economics, extension services. These are spheres that were in the past addressing some of these spaces we're talking about, but were doing so in ways that brought prescriptive baggage around class, race, gender, rural-urban relations, social relations more broadly, effects on land uses, and so forth. And those histories are fraught with real-life issues: hunger, starvation, discrimination, control, violence, and ecological destruction, right? And so, again, how do we bring that history back in a way that's meaningful, but is sort of, interesting for how we think about what options we have for today? But, you know, we keep coming back to the public aspect, and importantly, the public funding of this nation-building project is gone, outsourced to private entities far-flung. We're not responsible for it except in our consumer choices, as it's often framed. I may not agree with that, but I mean, that's one way that it's talked about a lot. And listening to conversations, that's come up in many ways, both as a kind of useful frame and as an unuseful frame. And so, you know, there's a couple of frames that I wanted to put out there then. One is that the object of the project must be to institute health, I suspect, which is to, you know, the capacity to thrive in the world. Health in a cultural, social, physical way. Health that encompasses more than the human and the humane. And, you know, we all live downstream from the axe and the frames that will roll back to us. And so, you know, figuring that out, and there were some interesting conversations around that. Another frame, I think, for me was how do we turn nature into edible human culture in ways that address ecology, resilience, natural system, but in doing so in non-reductive ways that also aren't constrained by the baggage of humanism. And I know there's a lot in all of those phrases, but I think they're all important, and they've come up in different ways. The biases or the spheres of knowledge that stand behind them in important ways have kind of been part of what we're doing here. That was my listening and comments. Thank you.
Our next listener is ELTON MYKEREZI. Is that close? Okay, good. ELTON's with the Applied Economics Department over on the St. Paul campus, or what we refer to as the main campus here at the university. His research has been on measuring household food insecurity and poverty, as well as identifying the causes and consequences of such deprivation. So, ELTON?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to be a listener in this event. Here are some of the things that I've heard over the last couple of days, and I actually heard a couple of them loud and clear today. So, of course, the main point is that we come from very different disciplines, and so we are bound to have very different ways of thinking about things, and certainly different methods. And we certainly heard today about how a Malthusian would think differently from a Kornikov, etc. So I sort of want to point out, at least from a social science perspective, that we could use what we have in common as a starting point for a discussion. So what I think we have in common is that we face very complicated issues. The questions that people ask of us are very difficult questions. And what we lack is the ability to experiment. A lot of other sciences have the ability to experiment. We have a very limited ability to experiment. For the most part, we have to observe life as it happened and try to abstract knowledge from it. Now, the way that we take those cuts are relatively different, but I think over the last few years they've been emerging. So to suggest that we have to gain a greater understanding of each other's methods would be a little utopic. I mean, and against sort of an efficient division of labor, so to speak. It's not useful for all of us to become experts in what all of us know. So I guess we have to find ways to explain our approaches to each other instead. And so I think the first sort of real issue that I heard over and over is that food issues, while they're very complex and in a certain sense very unique and different from other areas of life, cannot really be separated from other areas of life. Most of those are political, and I certainly heard that yesterday, and I heard it today, right? So part of what social scientists do is we think about policy. So how do we build policy? What's the role of policy today? What should be the role of policy today? Here's another starting point that we can all use and that we all share. We are all forced to think about what the government ought to do. So I think the discussion, a meaningful discussion, needs to start with, okay, what do you think the government ought to do in general, before we get to food issues, and how does that relate about how you think about human behavior in general, how do you think about physical constraints in general, and sort of the ways of the world and the general politics. Right? The other thing that I heard loud and clear is that, okay, we need to be patient. There could be 2 or 3 years before we even get to write a grant. And I can see why. These commonalities are a great starting point. And then we have to exert a whole lot of patience until we sort of see things each other's way, or at least understand where the other is coming from. The one thing that I heard today, and I actually found it sort of brilliant, was to bring into play the formal academic structure of peer review, and of course coupled with incentives, right? So Danny learned a lot from when he had to write a paper for a journal outside of his discipline. And I had the same experience. I'd had many conversations with people outside of my discipline, and sometimes those don't really, we talk for a little bit and then we just go on about our busy lives, and sometimes we meet again, sometimes we don't. But when we have to write this paper together, right? Well, I really want that paper to go through. I'm an assistant professor, right? Who doesn't want those papers to go through? So once I have an incentive to publish in this interdisciplinary journal, I put a lot of effort into understanding, okay, why do they want me to write this way? What's the logic of this particular structure? Why does this make sense? Why does it make sense for them but not for me? And so these are the ways that we learn. Unfortunately, or fortunately, if I want to still have a job, we respond to incentives very well, right? And so there are incentives within the academy that I think we should tweak to make them more friendly towards interdisciplinary research, right? So perhaps try to bump up, as silly as it may sound, try to bump up impact ratings of interdisciplinary journals, or have more of them, right? And the other thing that I also think we have in common is that as social scientists, in one way or the other, we are forced to think about choices. I don't think we can escape honestly asking the question, okay, how do people make choices? To what extent are those rational, calculated, the types of choices that would populate a microeconomic model of a classical economist, and then to what extent are they based on personal biases, heuristics, and things that that classic economists would call irrationalities, right? So by irrationalities, I mean exactly those things, personal biases, heuristics, self-deception sometimes, wishful thinking. And how do these things relate to policy, right? I think we should sort of follow in suit. And if we focus on how our inquiries are similar, how our methods are forced into being similar, how we are all forced into thinking about what the public sector ought to do, and how we are all forced into thinking about how do humans make decisions, I think those should be the cornerstones of the start of a good conversation. On the dual mission of the university, I have a split extension appointment, so sometimes I have to wonder about, okay, well, all of these things that I hear, I wonder if I should put together an educational program and try and teach this to people outside of the university, right? So, again, the only thing that I want to say about that is that we should also think of that in terms of how we think about how public money ought to be spent. It is public money that's funding the university, and it's supposed to generate this public knowledge, this public good. So in order to pin down the role that the extension or the outreach arm of land-grant universities should have in either inviting interdisciplinary research or disseminating it, right? We have to place it within the general framework of what role does public funding have in anything. And so I guess that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Okay, our third listener is Rachel Sherman. She's not that close, at least. She's with the sociology department here at the university. Conducts research on the sociology of food and agriculture with an emphasis on social movements and environmental and political sociology in Latin America. So, Rachel.
All right. Well, this has been an interesting 20 minutes because I've I've written one whole talk and I've decided I can't say it now because it's now irrelevant. But anyway, let me tell you what it was going to be about really briefly, because I still think there's some relevance in it. You know, I think there are a few questions that we have to ask when we have this conversation about how we talk about feeding the world. To me, the first question is, who is the we? Who is the we that we mean when we talk about feeding the world? And the question we need to start with is that very basic question of who is the we and who is the they that needs to be fed, and about people's own agency, that you know, mothers and fathers and peasants and others are agents, and we may choose to ignore their agency, but they are agents and they are feeding themselves. Of course, we can't have any conversations when we're all signaling to each other that we're in the know, or that we're not even aware that we're using terminology that makes absolutely no sense to other people. So I think trying to speak in plain language is a great idea. And you know, this raised for me the whole challenge of us being in what I call our own life worlds. Of course, there's a piece of jargon for you, but basically we're all in these little subcultures, and you know, ag econ is one, and I'm in sociology, and I'm in another, and cultural studies is in another, and we all, you know, plant physiology, we're all in these subcultures. So how do we come out of these worlds and even begin to understand each other? And one of the things that I've been pondering, and I have to say, I was in an interdisciplinary department in Berkeley in the mid-1990s. So it was me and a couple of plant and soil scientists and a physicist and an economist, and nobody who spoke my language. And you know, sometimes I got exhausted by just trying to keep up these conversations, even though other times I was elated by having them. But one of the questions that I always have is, how do you keep people engaged in the conversation? Because it takes a lot of energy, it takes an incredible amount of patience, goodwill, effort to build trust, and it frankly is very tiring, because you don't share assumptions. And so, you know, we really have to kind of identify what our assumptions are. We sort of have to step back and lay them out. And I think therein lies both the energy it takes, but also what's valuable about it. Because when we start to lay out those assumptions for other people, we recognize the assumptions that we're making ourselves. And I think that's a really useful process. So I guess that's one of the things I suggest that we think about, is how do we keep people engaged in these conversations. And you know, certain, both individuals and disciplines sort of disappear. Their time is too valuable to spend in these conversations. I won't name names. But anyway, I think it is a real problem. And that's part of the reason I think groups like Cargill and others aren't here, in part, not probably because we didn't invite them, but that was a mistake. But in any event, you know, how do we have conversations, especially with people that are far away, not just in terms of disciplines, but maybe in terms of assumptions and values? How do we reduce or overcome disparities of power within these conversations? And I think there's a couple different kinds of disparities. There are disparities among those of us who are in the conversation and come from different disciplines with different assumptions, but then there are the disparities of who's not even in the conversation. So yeah, how do we make those conversations more relevant to those who do have the power to shape the food system? And here I guess I would challenge us to remember, it isn't just the firms who are operating in the agro-food system, or the aid donors or others who do have a lot of power, but we have to find power in places that we may not be looking. In terms of food consumers, those food preparers, women who are making choices all the time. Anyway, those are the questions I guess I'll leave us with.
I guess what I'd like to do is give the group a chance, you know, to have some conversation here. So, take about 5 minutes on each of these, but first, what have you learned, you know, kind of as a group during the last couple of days here? Secondly, kind of what's the conversation that we should have as we move forward? You know, this is a very diverse topic, you know, that we're dealing with. And, you know, if a group's going to go forward on something like this, we need to be a little more focused. Okay, so if you're going to focus this conversation as we move forward, how would you focus it? And I guess third, given what your focus may be as we move forward, who else needs to be in this conversation? Who's not at the table?
I was going to say one thing we talked about at the table, but it was actually me. So, and due diligence, and I still have the question. You know, when the fearless student asked about what do I do with my philosophy degree to make the world a better place, but acknowledging the heavy debt load I have. Remember that comment?
Yes.
You know, students are fed here if they live on campus as part of their room and board package, but I do wonder when they leave their degree program here, when they graduate and move on with their lives, how many of them end up at risk for food insecurity in their own households for 5 to 10 years or more because of the debt load that they carry? And so we not only want them to be food literate or food synthesists across these various disciplines in terms of their academic training as something that we would like to valorize and maybe create programs around. But I also wonder in terms of the contemporary economic model that we're asking this generation to impoverish themselves for at least a couple of decades, and what that means for their own experience of hunger, and then tied to the discussion yesterday about the skills required given that new reality, because we're producing a generation of many, many people who have got to impoverish themselves to get this four-year education, and that's something that, how do we meaningfully rope that into what we'd like them to learn and understand about food and food-related problems?
If our goal is really in liberal arts education, and if our mission in the university is to provide, graduate people who are citizens, who are equipped to engage with life in what is a mass consumer society. And they're going to, for the rest of their lives, engage with the food economy at least 2 or 3 times a day. It seems to me that part of the task of raising citizens and of cultivating a critical citizenship would be to educate people about where their food comes from and how it gets into their mouths. It's something they do every single day that has a tremendous impact and connection with the world. And it just seems to me that as a kind of old-fashioned notion of what a core curriculum that includes being a citizen in this particular society at this time is, that everybody should get a course on where their food comes from.
Can I add on to that as kind of a report back from our table? I think that may actually be the research question that we came up with as well. That how are people feeding themselves is not something we know. And that to the degree that we have to answer that with people whose answers to it are uncomfortable to us, but that we can stay with it, possibly through something supportive like a food curriculum, that's really good for us for all the reasons that we've been talking about for the last few days, to say, oh, yeah, the assumptions I bring to this have blinded me to the methods you're using that may be useful, and maybe we don't know how people are getting food.
With the curriculum, I made a roundtable with students here in this building this week and asked them where you buy your food, how you process, how you cook, and how you eat. And I wish to underline this approach to introduce all the students in the first semester, you said, in the whole process change, but they should experience it, the whole thing, not only theoretically. And then theoretically, they can learn what is system theory, what is social capital theory, because it's in this how I look for my food and so on. So we have both, we have the experiences We have the food science, we have the agriculture, but we have also the social science theory because it's a university. We should also talk about the theories, even a soil test. Why not?
I would encourage you not to forget the humanities people. As we found out after he left, we had a person here from the English department. There's so many examples of real life experiences in literature of how people eat. I mean, we don't really have to go that far. I mean, but we can go as far back as any European writer can go, and you can find references to how people have eaten over time. And so I think it's important as we talk about the social scientists and the STEM and so forth, not to forget the humanities, because we actually do.
I'm an undergraduate, and so I want to put support on the curriculum piece because, all right, so we come to college, and I found out that I was really very lucky to have spent some of my early life on the farm. I knew how to grow food. I know how to freeze food. I could probably learn, again, real fast how to can food if I had, a surplus of food to can. And after my friends moved out of the dorms, and I have a whole bunch to say about the quality of food in the dorms, but I won't go into it. After they moved out of the dorms, most of my friends now eat ramen, and they eat packaged foods, and they eat what they can buy for less than $10 a week, which is actually what I spend on food myself, because I lead a a vegetarian lifestyle just because I can't afford meat. And so learning how to do that in the curriculum, there's nowhere else for us to learn it. And so that would be a really valuable step towards being better citizens, because how can we be better citizens if we can't feed ourselves, if we can't understand, like, this is what it means to come to, as Bernard was saying in our group, what it means to come to a table and eat together. And so that would be super valuable if we could ever get that in place.
I'm not convinced that we should do that, or we should continue to do this step without stakeholders from the so-called real world. I made my second and third round table with farmers this week, and that means I'm listening 6 hours, and they talk and talk and talk, and they do not understand what we do in the university, and I agree. They cannot understand. And for that, I would modify your idea to create transdisciplinary groups where we talk with the society and try to find out how we organize our future research.
Word. We talked, I think that everyone around the table, our table, was probably pretty excited about the things we heard other people talking about the curriculum, but actually we didn't talk about the curriculum. One of the kind of research question we thought about would be, how do you map a food shed? What do you put on the map? What would you put on the map? How do you make things visible? And I think that we did think that who else needs to be in the conversation? There clearly need to be people from other universities on the conversation, and people who are not at the university at all on the conversation.
There are actual, policy and political action decisions being undertaken, in the agronomy department and out in the community about, is still it seems like, is there a way to bring, disciplines like agronomy and people out in the community into reflecting on those kinds of things without as soon as you step into the discussion hearing, you're sexist, you're racist, which is accusations that people of conscience take very seriously, and if they're not in social science, are not accustomed to feeling like, and so that gets translated in people's heads as you are insufficiently politically correct, which is not the correct translation, but that gets heard, and so it's a way of, and so then you feel booted out of the conversation and you don't want to talk about, and so then you don't wind up reflecting on power dynamics and class and race at all, and which is really important. And so
Like I think the question would be, is there a way to bring disciplines and community groups that are making unreflective decisions in to reflect upon decisions using the tools of social science without feeling, an accusation and then alienation.
With HECUA and a local consortium on, which basically uses experiential education. I think they're providing a really useful model that we might think about, where they use experiential education and put students out in the community working on particularly urban social justice issues, but also agriculture, agroecological issues, in ways that really step them through thinking a lot about these kind of developmental questions. Like, how do you scaffold understanding of these critiques without disempowering people or making them feel like this sort of debilitating guilt? So they kind of, like, they've thought through a lot of this anti-racist practice in ways, and they're here in town working on this stuff, so to kind of build in models where people are doing that well rather than reinventing it, I guess.
What the university is doing and our food is related to social relations, and that it's embedded in these broader power dynamics and decisions, and so food can't be studied on itself, right? And agriculture can't be studied by itself. It has to be understood as a political economy, a social object, etc.
I was asked to give some pearls of wisdom at the end here, and I have to tell you, I spent 4 years working in the coal fields of southwestern Virginia on mine reclamation. I'm more likely just to give you lumps of coal, so I'm not going to go there. I think we've had some fantastic, conversation here in the last hour or so. We've captured that on the video, so we have the pearls of wisdom. I think right there. I will say that for me, one of the things that I found that was particularly useful and enlightening, for these last couple of days was as a soil scientist coming in and as somebody who has a legacy of working with agriculture and with food, to understand that there's so many other different professions and disciplines out there that also deal in food. I didn't know we had food historians. I mean, that's fascinating to me, and the cultural aspects of it. And, this has really been eye-opening. So I certainly hope that, it's had some of that same effect for everybody else.